Welcome to the Global Justice Report, an online production of the Center for Global Justice. I'm Cliff Durand, your host for today's program. The Center for Global Justice, El Centro para la Justicia Global, is a multinational and bilingual research and learning center in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. The center is devoted to research and learning for a better world and empowering a solidarity economy. Due to the pandemic, we've discontinued our in-person events and instituted online webinars. Without our previous revenue-generating programs, we now depend on your donations to support these webinars and to be able to continue to pay our Mexican staff. You can donate at our website, www.globaljusticecenter.org. And for those of you who speak English rather than American, center is spelled C-E-N-T-E-R. We've been doing these webinars since June 1st, so we're almost to the end of a full year of broadcasting. We're happy to have for this special May Day webinar, not quite on May Day, but almost, so we will acknowledge it, a special speaker on Cuba. She is Helen Yaffe, author of the book, We Are Cuba, how a revolutionary people have survived in a post-Soviet world. She'll be talking about her book, but also much more, particularly more recent developments and the current reforms rejuvenating socialism. Helen is a rising authority on Cuba, a lecturer in economic and social history at the University of Glasgow. She's also a visiting fellow at the Latin American and Caribbean Center in the London School of Economics. Over the last 25 years, she's spent considerable time living and researching in Cuba. She's often sought by the media for comment and analysis on the ever-changing Cuban scene, and is also often sought as a speaker in webinars on Cuba. She's recently produced a documentary film, Cuba and COVID-19, Public Health, Science, and Solidarity, and earlier published a book on Che Guevara, the subject of her doctoral dissertation.
Thing is, if I
ask all of you, to mute your microphones so we don't hear extraneous noises. But also, Helen has asked that you turn on your video camera so she can see who she's talking to, rather than talking to a bunch of blank black squares. We want to welcome all of you who are here in the Zoom room with us. And let me turn the floor over to Helen Yaffe.
Okay, thank you very much, Cliff. Thanks for the invitation, and thanks to everyone at the Centre for Global Justice for giving me another opportunity to talk about the contents of my book. Some of you have probably heard quite a bit about it or even read it, so apologies to you. And yes, I like to see faces when I'm talking. That is the teacher in me. So thank you for keeping your videos on. I'm starting my stopwatch and I'm going to try and keep to a maximum of 40 minutes for this intro. I hope that you can see that. I've shared my screen. Can you all see that? Yeah, okay, great. So here we are, Centre for Global Justice, and these are the title of my book. We have survived in a post-Soviet world, which was published last spring at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. Of revolution. Okay, so or academics or people who are speaking say something about their background and where their ideas and their interest comes from. So I think you probably all know the song, maybe. My Heart is in Havana. It's a lovely song. I went to live in Havana in 1995 and I stayed there till 96. I was 18 years old and I went with my older sister. We went to experience Cuba for ourselves in almost the worst period, but certainly in the midst of what is known as the special period of economic crisis in Cuba, when GDP had collapsed by 35% and Cuba had lost 86. So we had an experience of being in Cuba. This is a photo I took, a whole family of 4 on a bike. That was very, very events, and every time leaving behind a growing network of family, friends, and colleagues. I also undertook my doctoral research in Cuba which looked at Che Guevara's work as president of the National Bank of Cuba, Minister of Industries, and all the other important jobs that he had, which were about the very challenging task, not of seizing power, but actually carrying out the transition to socialism after 1959. And then I returned to Cuba frequently for research for this book, We Are Cuba. Okay, so what's interesting about Cuba? Well, Cuba, I think we would all agree, is a country of contradictions. So for 60 years, Cuba has defied expectations and flouted the rules. It is a poor country with world-leading human development indicators. A small island that mobilizes the world's largest international humanitarian assistance. A weak and dependent economy, but it has survived economic crisis and the most extensive punitive unilateral sanctions that any country has been subject to with the United States blockade. It is considered anachronistic, but it's also innovative. Formally, it is ostracized, certainly by the US administration. Trump administration was a prime example. And yet it has millions of ardent defenders around the world. And we've seen this growing movement of caravans, people going out around the world to call for an end of the US blockade since the start of this year. So this is the interesting thing, isn't it? Despite meeting many of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and there they are in that box at the top, Cuba's development strategy is not upheld as an example, and we can think about why that is. Okay, so I'm putting out lots of points here to encourage a discussion and a debate, and also people who are watching on YouTube, they can send in questions and comments too. Now, Cuba is often seen from a very exceptionalist point of view, but I would like to locate Cuba in a much broader historical and global scenario, and that is the challenge of development. Most of the world's countries are called underdeveloped, developing, emerging economies, whatever you want to talk, whatever terminology you want to use, global South countries, and they face this challenge of development. And we can break this down into a set of questions. How do countries develop? Is the free market or state action decisive? And there's a renewed debate about this in economic history and development studies and so on. Where can developing countries get the capital that they need to invest in infrastructure and social welfare? And how can foreign capital be obtained under conditions which do not obstruct independent development or undermine sovereignty? So this is the problem with IFIs, international financial institutions, and conditionality that they put for loans. How can international trade be used to produce a surplus in a global economy that is marked by deteriorating terms of trade? So the poorer countries are constantly getting less for what they export and the cost of what they need. So unequal terms of trade. So after the revolution, for the Cuban revolutionaries of the 1950s, for them, the US imperialism and the domination of the Cuban economy and politics that stemmed from it was the principal explanation for the island's structural weaknesses. So once they seized power, the diverse multi-class revolutionary forces faced two real alternatives. They could either renounce fundamental change in order to be acceptable to Washington, the US government, in other words, operate within the limits imposed by by Cuba's subordination to the United States, or they could pursue deep structural changes, breaking dependent relationship with the US and building real sovereignty to confront US imperialism and allied Cuban interests, domestic interests in Cuba. So the leadership of the revolution, Fidel Castro, Raúl, Che Guevara, and all of those around them, the post-1959 government chose state action, that is, the central plan and state ownership over the free market as the lever for development to tackle Cuba's historical development challenges. Now, this is important to assert because the literature in English for academics, for students, Cubanology literature is full of this line that Fidel Castro turned to the Soviet Union as socialism or communism because it was the best way for him to outdo his rivals and take ultimate power. So I certainly think that is simplistic and wrong, but we have to understand it in these political economy terms. Now, once the Cuban revolutionary government had decided to adopt socialism, it faced the challenge of how to build socialism in Cuba. The commitment to a planned economy and state ownership hasn't changed for 60 years, but there is a lack of consensus of how to increase productivity and efficiency, which is the ultimate objective within socialism. And the first expression of this debate was in the early 1960s, something actually called retrospectively the Great Debate, which took place. It was initiated by Che Guevara as Minister of Industries, and he was in dispute with other leading ministers and intellectuals, let's say, in different ministries who wanted to more closely emulate the Soviet economic and planning management system. Now, and here's a picture of Che, a very rare picture. He didn't often allow photography in his Ministry of Industries. So this debate, what is the best way to achieve socialism in a trade-dependent, blockaded, underdeveloped country, has continued. And it explains why in this period, there's been 5 different economic management systems within the first 3 decades of the revolution, that is to 1990, and arguably 3 or more distinct approaches since the 1990s, i.e. in the post-Soviet period. What was different about them? Well, each one reframed the relationship between market mechanisms and the state plan according to economic and political imperatives of the period, and very importantly, according to international conditions. So I have a chapter that looks at this and briefly goes over them, and it focuses more on something called rectification of errors and negative tendencies, which was a new swing away from the Soviet model from the mid-1980s, in which the Cuban political economy, Cuban economic management begins to forge its own path once again. And arguably, this is really key to understanding how Cuba survives when the domino effect happens and the Soviet bloc countries, socialist republics, all revert back to capitalism. Okay, so This is the process. Rectification it's cut short basically by the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, interestingly, in summer 1989, Fidel Castro spoke on the 26th of July day, his annual speech, and said these words, which took many Cubans, most Cubans arguably, by surprise. He said, if we were to wake up and learn that the USSR had disintegrated, even under those circumstances, Cuba and the Cuban Revolution would continue struggling and resisting. So the special period, which was a special period in a time of peace, it was special measures to deal with economic crisis. It's associated with the collapse of the Soviet bloc. But interestingly, it actually began 16 months before the USSR fell. It represents a period of crisis management without military confrontation, and it became an enduring feature of Cuban reality. There's a debate about the extent to which the special period has finished, or when it did finish, or whether it prevails. The Cuban revolutionary leadership made a decision, supported by the population, I would argue, to remain committed to socialism. It was against the economic rationality of capitalism. So instead of cuts and austerity, privatizations that we saw in the former socialist countries, you had welfare spending prioritized. Planning was used to harness and direct scarce resources according to political and social priorities. And this table here really demonstrates this perfectly. So the line that you see, which plummets down, that is the real GDP growth. And as you can see, there's a collapse that represents a collapse of over a third within 3 years. And at the same time, the bar graphs, that is official unemployment. Now, in any capitalist country, you would expect to see a fall of the GDP, and economic collapse leads to an increase in unemployment. And what you saw in Cuba was actually the opposite. A political decision and a social decision, arguably, was taken to keep people in employment. So they weren't abandoned to their fate, which is a term that Raul Castro used often. So the chapter I have on the special period looks at the vulnerability of the Cuban economy in the 1990s. It was particularly large state monopoly on finance and on banking and trade. And it was particularly vulnerable to the collapse of the Soviet bloc. So then I go on to look at the grave economic, socio-economic impacts and the measures that were taken to alleviate the social crisis, the appearance of malnutrition and infectious disease rises and so on, and the measures that were taken to address those as quick as possible. The economy was restructured for reinsertion into a global capitalist market. And let's be clear, there was no alternative for Cuba. The result was, to a degree, an increase in inequality and illegality with the so-called black market and informal employment and so on. But there was also a parallel process of political participation increasing, and community mobilization proved to be very important for getting people collectively through a severe economic and social crisis. There were a number of agricultural changes, very important, including the shift to organic and urban farming, which sees Cuba become outstanding globally in its record of achieving sustainable development. Cuba is actually #1 in the new Sustainable Development Index, which was published last year. But I also talk about the deep scars of the special period and how many of the reforms that have taken place since then can only really be understood in relation to the impact of the special period and the measures taken to deal with it. Okay, so as the economy starts to recover, it's quite an exception, quite an incredibly quick recovery that is the result of these reforms. We have a new process. I've called it Fidel Castro's Citizens' Army. Lots of people will know it as the Battle of Ideas. And this starts as the struggle over the Cuban boy, Elian Gonzalez, the shipwrecked boy. His mother had taken him with a group of others, a dozen or so, on a raft, on a boat, which was not seaworthy. and most of them die. It's a tragic story. It's a tragic family tragedy. And Elian Gonzalez is one of 3 survivors, and he gets taken into the heart of the Cuban American community opposition to the Cuban Revolution in Miami. And there's a custody battle. I'm telling you, most of you will know and remember it very well. But this grows into the Battle of Ideas, and it's a very interesting process about how that happens, that Fidel Castro gets a group of youth leaders together and they start a very critical an examination of what is the reality for Cuban communities and Cuban individuals after the very traumatic impacts of the special period. Now, it happens in the context of escalating US hostility. This is the President Bush Jr. era, the era of wars and occupations, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Cuba is in some ways put in the sight hairs of the rifle when John Bolton comes out and claims that they're developing biological weapons. So the Battle of Ideas emphasizes the importance of education and culture in inculcating a commitment to socialism, which is needed at this point to resist this imperialist offensive, and also an internal layer which threatens the socialist revolution. So through this period, we have a set of economic improvements that enable the state to address material deprivation. So there's an increase of material assistance, but this time it's the characteristic that is unique of this period is it's targeted. So they are doing these investigations to work out the situations of individual families, and they are providing material assistance for those families. This shows this period of the Battle of Ideas. It's been very dismissed outside Cuba, very badly understood, I would say. But one thing is clear, it demonstrates the revolution's ability to rejuvenate its ranks, of its leadership, of its activists, and the composition of its vanguard. It creates a new layer of revolutionary protagonists known as the disconnected youth. They're young people under 20 mainly, who are outside work and outside employment. And they become a citizens' army of social workers working in their own communities to address those problems, emergent teachers desperately trying to raise the ratio of teachers to students in Cuba's rundown schools, and medical internationalists, because this is the era where medical internationalism in Latin America particularly takes off. And some of these projects were, there's hundreds of projects developed under the Battle of Ideas, too many to list, but one, let's say the culmination of one aspect of them was that they surveyed the entire population of under 15-year-olds, or 15 and under, 2 million people, doing a thorough investigation on their biological, physiological and social situation. They identified those that they saw as vulnerable and started to address those vulnerabilities, whether it was helping to provide employment for their parents, or providing new fridges, or whatever it was. Okay, so this kind of overlaps or dovetails or rolls into something called the energy revolution. Energy is an issue of national security for Cuba. It always has been. As Luis Perez, the president of the NGO Cuba Solar, said to me, what's the first thing the US did after the revolution? Cut off our oil supply. What's the first thing the Soviets did? Provide us with oil. So what I was most interested in when I did this, the research for this chapter, is I was interested to learn how early research had begun in Cuba into renewable technologies in the late 1980s. But there was a lack of incentives for Cuba to adopt renewable energies as a sort of provider, a substantial provider of its energy matrix. I mean, partly the technology wasn't available, but they also had an abundance of Soviet oil provided at below market rates. So, you know, there was a lack of incentive. However, by 2005, we have something called the energy revolution, which I can talk about more, but it's basically a major state initiative to improve energy security and energy efficiency. And it does that by introducing 1,500 in the first instance new generators, small local generators in what's called a distributed system. Cuba has the second best distributed system in the world after this, after Norway, I think it is. Progressive electricity tariffs and the replacement of old durable goods, energy guzzling goods, with energy saving equipment and introducing renewable energies. This is Fidel Castro examining in this picture the new pressure cookers which were distributed to every Cuban household. So in the post-2000 period, there's a shift towards renewable energies, which is embedded in the Cuban plan for national economic development up to 2030. Today, there is a commitment from the state for a major shift to take place in the energy mix. But unfortunately, like every sector in Cuba, it is being severely obstructed by the US blockade. Okay, so moving on to another really fascinating and really important sector that has developed, not just in the post-Soviet period, but actually very early on in Cuba. And this is the curious case of Cuba's biotech revolution. A lot of people have recently noticed this because of the COVID-19 pandemic, which I'll mention. Okay, I interviewed Augustin Laje, who was the director of the Center for Molecular Immunology, CIM. They have developed the world's first lung cancer immunotherapy, which is currently under trials at Roswell Park Cancer Institute in the United States. He talked about the biotech sector being the first time in Cuba's economic history that it had incorporated itself into an emerging industrial sector. And it is incredible. The world's first biotech enterprise was set up in 1976 in the United States. It was a joint venture between a venture capitalist and a biochemist. And just 5 years later, the Cuban government found something called the Biological Front to develop basically biotechnology in Cuba. It's founded with state investment. And this is the 1980s when, this wasn't really part of Cuba's role within the so-called socialist division of labor within the Council of Mutual Economic Assistance, the Soviet bloc trade and investment bloc. But Cuba was determined. This is consistent with a vision. Fidel Castro in 1960 had stood in front of the Academy of Sciences in a speech and said, the future of Cuba must be a future of people of science. This is at a point where 25% of the population was completely illiterate. There was, hardly any universities in the country and so on. But this was a commitment that was made very early on to invest in science and technology for social development. And let's remember that the United States blockade includes medicine and equipment. So Cuba has a need to develop some capacity in terms of medicine and medical equipment. The Cuban biopharma sector is, as I said, state-owned. Profit is not sought domestically. The institutions, multiple institutions that exist for different research and development projects, they focus on cooperating over resources, not competing. And this sector is integrated into Cuba's public health and education system. Most important and most distinctive, and we can see that today in the context of the pandemic, is that it is driven by public health demand. So Cuba, lost the import of medicines from the Soviet bloc and was really forced to focus on domestic production of medicines. It's achieved close to 70% of its medicines being domestically produced. This is all before the COVID-19 pandemic, nearly 200 inventions and products marketed in 50 countries and partnerships in global South countries. This sector has really come, as I said, to international attention because Cuba's biotech sector has been essential in Cuba's quite exemplary response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Cuba has 5 COVID-19 vaccines under clinical trials, 2 of them at phase 3. So there's only 23 globally vaccines, COVID-19 vaccines that are at that stage, and 2 of them are Cuban, which is incredible. But it has other world firsts from its biotech sector: world first for meningitis B, world first for lung cancer immunotherapy, world first to eliminate mother-to-child HIV transmission, world first for a human vaccine with a synthetic antigen. So there is a real incredible record that explains why Cuba's been able to do so well in the context of the pandemic. Okay, so linked to that has been Cuba's medical internationalism, and known often as an army of white coats. And I'll start with this wonderful quote from Dr. Fernandez, who was in Liberia combating the Ebola epidemic. And he said, "While I have strength and they accept me, I will go where I'm needed." And that really is what we've seen historically and today in the context of the pandemic. Why do they do it? There's a big debate, you know, there's a lot of misinformation and attempt to sort of undermine the prestige of Cuba for doing this. But I would argue that this is part of a broader struggle. Revolutionary Cuba has promoted the global struggle against underdevelopment, colonialism, neocolonialism, and imperialism. They view global poverty and poor health as a result of those exploitative structural conditions. So for Cuba, it was the same logic that led it to send soldiers to Angola to fight against the invading army of apartheid South Africa, as to send 20,000 medics to Venezuela. So that's what I would argue. There's different forms of assistance in terms of medical internationalism. We have the emergency medical brigades. That was the first form of medical internationalism in Cuba. So in 1960, despite having very few and certainly insufficient number of doctors, they say it was 6,250 physicians in Cuba at the time of the revolution. Half of them left in the first months or year or so, and despite that, Cuba sent a medical team to Chile after its devastating earthquake in 1960, and despite not having good relations with the government there. And that's been a feature of Cuban medical internationalism in terms of these emergency medical brigades. They're also developed along the lines of helping to set up and run public health services. This began in newly independent Algeria in 1963. And there's loads of examples, and we can talk more in the discussion, but I don't want to get stuck on this. It's just an incredible history. There's also the form of treating foreigners in Cuba. So actually the first were the Algerians during the national liberation struggle, who were brought back to Cuba to give treatment. But a really incredible example of this is the Children for Chernobyl program, which the world seemed to have forgotten around the 30th anniversary of the nuclear disaster in Chernobyl. But some 26,000 people, mainly from Ukraine, but also surrounding countries, were taken to Cuba, where they received treatment that was completely free over a 21-year period, and 24,000 of those beneficiaries were children. So, and then the final form of medical internationalism is training foreigners. And the wonderful example lots of you will know about is the Latin American School of Medicine, which was set up in 1999 and has now graduated something like 30,000 medics from all over the world. It began as something to deal with the terrible scarcity of medics in Central America after the Cubans went to assist after a set of natural disasters. But subsequently, it has students from Africa, Asia, even from the United States studying there, and most of them still for free, only some of them pay. So by 2019, we have this incredible statistic that over 400,000 Cuban medical professionals had worked overseas in 164 countries. Tens of thousands more tens of thousands of foreigners had been treated or trained in Cuba. It may be hundreds of thousands. I don't have the statistics. And Cuban healthcare missions had become pivotal in the Latin America welfare-focused development strategies in the post-2000 period. So I'm talking about Chavez, Bolivarian revolution in Venezuela, the citizens' revolution in Ecuador, the movement towards socialism in Bolivia, and so on. And also, you know, up to 13,000 medics went to Brazil under Dilma Rousseff. And this became, from that same period, from the mid-2000s, the principal source of revenue for the Cuban state. Now, this was identified by the US administration and the Trump administration particularly. This had been done actually by the Bush administration in the 2000s as well. The Trump administration moved to destroy Cuba's prestige from its medical internationalism, and its real concern was to undermine and stop its revenues to reinforce the blockade, essentially. Okay. So, I just wanted to add that within about a year of the COVID-19 being called a pandemic, Cuba had sent 57 brigades of the Henry Reeve contingent of disaster response and disease control specialists. They had been to 40 countries and treated 1.26 million COVID-19 patients. And that is despite Cuba suffering quite severely during the pandemic, but also from the US sanctions, which I'll mention soon. Okay, so I have another chapter because, of course, you can't talk about Cuban development without discussing Cuba-US relations. And I think we have to be absolutely clear. The greatest obstacle to Cuban development is the United States blockade. And if anyone doubts that, I would encourage them to look at the actual legislation. I've just written a chapter about the US blockade for a book on sanctions as war, and it's absolutely clear. And you know, that's one of a package of aggressions or measures that Cuba has faced from the United States. However, I interviewed Josefina Vidal, who at that time was leading Cuba's US department and had been leading in the secret negotiations with the Obama administration from 2013. She said, history has shown that pressure, preconditions and aggression do not work with Cuba. I think that, you know, the evidence is there to support that statement. I mean, this is 60 years of conflict, and the balance of power has clearly lain with the United States, but we should also be clear that Cuba has not been a subservient neighbor. It's supported revolutionary struggles. It has supported insurrection against the US allies. It has made itself a global player against colonial governments and imperialist governments around the world. It has been a vociferous defender of Puerto Rico, of Palestine, and so on and so forth. Now, the US has taken overt and covert actions, including sabotage and terrorism. There is a document which registers the death of well over 3,000 people as a result of terrorism supported by or launched by people in the US or with the support of the US government, including the US blockade is not a bilateral question, it's extraterritorial. The United States uses its leverage over the US dollar. 88% of international transactions take place with the dollar. That's a figure from 2019. So it uses its control. It uses the Office of Foreign Asset Controls, OFAC, from the US Treasury to threaten people with huge fines for dealing with Cuba in any way. It has pursued a policy to isolate and ostracize Cuba in international forums. It has promoted illegal and dangerous emigration. One example is Operation Peter Pan, which saw thousands of minors, of infants and minors sent out of Cuba under the spurious claim that the Cuban government was going to take them from their parents. They were sent unaccompanied to the United States, and many of them were never reunited with their parents again. And then the Cuban medical parole program introduced under the Bush administration, as I said, part of that effort to undermine Cuban medical internationalism. And they've also obstructed legal migration. And we can see that today. The US has closed its consular services in Havana, making it very difficult for people. And remember, 1 in 3 Cubans has relatives in the United States, but making it almost impossible to leave, actually impossible to leave by legal means. And at the same time, there has been lucrative funding for regime change programs. At least 20 million is approved by Congress. This is seen as an investment in regime change. This massive amount of money sloshing around has created many vested interests, and they obstruct normalization, they obstruct any improvement in relations or dismantling of this apparatus of hostility, because they are actually making careers out of it. These actions, regime change actions, increased in the 1990s, where Cuba was found itself alone after the collapse of the Soviet bloc, and actually continued under Obama, including after rapprochement was announced. And there was all sorts of disclosures about USAID programs to use Twitter-style programs, to use hip-hop groups and culture and so on. The aggression intensified under the Trump administration. During his administration, 242 new measures, actions, and sanctions were introduced, 54 of them during the pandemic. So when the UN and other international bodies were asking any sanctioning countries to drop sanctions, especially those that affected a country's capacity to react to COVID-19, the United States increased sanctions, and the Cubans have suffered. They have struggled to access ventilators. They have struggled to access PPE. They are struggling now, despite having the capacity to vaccinate their population, to access something so cheap and easily available as syringes. Okay. The Cuban state, we have to recognize, has devised versatile defense against US aggression, and international solidarity has been an important part of that. Okay, moving on now to Raul Castro's reforms. I know that Cliff particularly wanted me to address this question, and the chapter is the question: are these about socialist efficiency, or are they a capitalist opening? I think now it's much clearer that they weren't a capitalist opening, but an opening to capitalist market mechanisms. But at the time, every time a new measure was introduced, the international mainstream media would applaud that, Raul was embracing capitalism. So these reforms were formalized. They were initiated in 2008 and formalized in 2009 with something known as the Guidelines for Updating the Economic and Political System. They sought to improve efficiency and productivity within the socialist framework. Again, going back to that initial point about the challenge of development for a socialist country. They opened space for market mechanisms, and they sought foreign direct capital. Cuba needed capital to, sought foreign capitals. Cuba needs capital in order to invest in its infrastructure and build its, advance its technologies and so on. But it's very limited where Cuba can get capital from. It doesn't have access to international financial institution loans or credits. So it's focused on FDI and remittances. And to encourage remittances, it's necessary to expand the non-state sector. So those people will be receiving remittances from abroad. So this chapter frames the measures that were taken chronologically in terms of the problems they intended to address and the results that were achieved or experienced. These were structural changes to rebalance the economy and bolster domestic economy in response to complex international conditions. So let's not forget, the start of this period is the international financial crisis of 2008, and Cuba was deeply affected by that crisis, plus 2 devastating hurricanes that happened on that same year. So we have this constant tension between political preference and economic necessity, which, as I said, is the need for capital to invest. But you also have a distinctive feature of a reform process is extensive grassroots participation in nationwide debates that shape policy and legislation and secure legitimacy and acceptance for the changes overway. So you have these young people here, they're reading the draft guidelines, and they will then go on to take part in a consultation and give their views. The process of national and sectorial consultations was repeated throughout Raúl Castro's decade as president. But this, of course, created contradictions and challenges to open to the market within a socialist framework. And I call this the Cuban tightrope. So it's balancing between the market and the plan. The post-2011 reform process increased contradictions within Cuban political economy. Market exchanges were encouraged, private accumulation, and the emergence of, in Marxist terms, exploitative social relations, an employer who employs someone but keeps the surplus from that work. So this leads to an internal debate within Cuba about which very little was actually noted or written or commented outside Cuba at the time. I'm talking about 2014, 15. Cuban social scientists quite strongly criticized the economic reforms for their narrow focus on economic efficiency at the cost of social equity. And they demanded action to halt growing inequality and marginalization. So those who didn't receive remittances were being left behind. Those who weren't setting up small businesses were being left behind. And there was a huge reduction in state spending on social welfare, social assistance. So around this point, non-state, a couple of years in, non-state licenses were suspended and the institutional apparatus was strengthened. So the ability to audit, tax, monitor, and restrict. This is a country with for generations has had no experience in those basic apparatus. So the state reinforced control over production, distribution, and prices to protect the population. And what this shows us is the innate tendency within the Cuban Revolution to reassert the centrality of social justice in the development process, even at the cost of economic growth. I'm nearly finished. I just need to, I was actually finishing my manuscript when the Trump administration started to introduce quite intense pressure on Cuba by lifting the suspension on the Title III of the Helms-Burton Act and other measures threatening to fine shipping companies. So I had to add another chapter. So I'm adding another slide here. This is about surviving into the post-rapprochement period. We saw a return to a kind of Cold War hostility under Trump. Key characters are Marco Rubio and the Cuban-American power brokers in the United States. All sorts of trade-offs were happening, and the Cuban population were paying the price. This was part of a broader offensive against socialism in the region, the attack on Venezuela, then the turn in Ecuador, the coup in Bolivia, and so on. And the result was tangible and painful. There were oil, food, and equipment shortages. Foreign investors and trade partners scared off. Cuban revenues were blocked, including healthcare services. And I shouldn't be talking in past tense because the situation remains the same. The question is now, is Cuba returning to the special period? And how will the revolutionary people survive into the post-rapprochement period? And again, we see that the state mobilizes the existing apparatus to channel scarce resources. It increased control over distribution to protect the population from scarcities. It raised state salaries and searched for domestic solutions. So the constant push that we have to produce more domestically and so on and so forth. And this is a photo here of one of the endless long lines Cubans have been suffering. They're getting up at 4 or 5 in the morning to join queues for shops that don't open for 6 or 7 hours because there is such a problem of scarcity directly imposed by US sanctions, measures, and actions. And the context of this is a new president, Miguel Díaz-Canel, born after the Cuban Revolution seized power, born in 1960, and the introduction of a new constitution, again, subject to a process of mass consultation and participation. We can discuss all of those things in the discussion, but I should conclude So I've overrun how long I said I would go. In conclusion, revolutionary Cuba continues to defy expectations and flout rules, creating an alternative model of development that prioritizes human welfare and the environment. That this poor blockaded island has achieved world-leading human development indicators, that it mobilizes the world's largest international humanitarian assistance, that it has contributed to global innovations in medical science, that its contributions in culture and the arts are admired throughout the world, is an achievement to be examined and respected. And we're left to ask, what could the revolutionary people of Cuba achieve if they were left in peace, if they were finally given the chance to prosper and not just survive? Okay, that's it. Thank you very much. That's the end. This is the link to the documentary, which Cliff mentioned. It's called Cuba and COVID-19, Public Health, Science and Solidarity. And here are 2 links where you can support Cuba's mass vaccination campaign, helping to buy syringes and other important medical equipment that's needed. 2 different links. I know this is happening with campaigns all around the world, so I'd encourage you to do that. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Helen, for a comprehensive overview of the last 60 years of one of the most fascinating social experiments that has graced this epoch in which we live. By the way, if you want, could you take those links in your last slide and put them into the chat box so that people can copy them?
Yeah, I will do that.
Okay. Okay. We're now ready for the Q&A, and I want to give you a few instructions on that. Some of you are watching this on YouTube, and if you have questions or comments, the best way to get them to us is by emailing them to global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. I will monitor that and relay your questions to our speakers here in the Zoom room. But for those in the Zoom room, well, you can you can present your questions much more directly and engage in dialogue with our speaker if you wish. So I'm putting my screen on gallery view so that I can see everybody. And if you have a question, just raise your hand or wave at me, and I'll call on you to unmute yourself. And there's Harry Targ. I don't know if he's just saying hello or if he's putting his hand up for a question. But we'll go first with Harry, and then I see David Schweikert, and then there's William. I see his hand. There are a number of other people here who, by the way, have their video off. If you would turn your video on, we'd like to see you, and then you can unmute yourself when you're called on. So, Harry.
Let's see. Thank you, Helen, for a wonderful talk, and your book is wonderful as well. I wonder if you could comment on the magnitude, extent, and level of enthusiasm for communes in Cuba.
Okay, how are we doing this? Can I ask you, Harry, do you mean communes or cooperatives?
I'm sorry, cooperatives.
Okay, I thought so. So enthusiasm for cooperatives. Are we taking a few questions or?
Well, if you would like, we could take a few if there are other questions that are related to that. In fact, I have one that is directly related. When under the reforms, non-state sectors of the economy were opened up that included self-employment, private enterprise, as well as cooperatives. And initially there were authorization of a number of cooperatives, some of which were founded, some actually never did materialize. But then a halt was caused to that. And so my question, and this is a question that I've posed to Helen before, why is that? Why is it that they froze what was admittedly an experiment in cooperatives, but halted it? And though they've nominally lifted that freeze, from what I can tell, there aren't a lot of new cooperatives forming. But then there's Harry's question, how much enthusiasm is there for cooperatives among the population?
Okay. Al's got his hand up. Are you taking more, or
No,
is it new cooperatives, Al?
that's a lot to chew on.
Maybe you want to answer for me.
You know, Al, did you want to speak to that point?
We can't hear you.
We still don't have your sound.
Okay. Yeah, so just on cooperatives, I mean, Cliff, you probably know as much as me. The number of cooperatives formally, let's just be clear for people who aren't aware of this. We're talking about non-agricultural cooperatives, which is quite distinct because Cuba has had agricultural cooperatives, and they actually represent quite a significant proportion. In fact, the largest proportion of agriculture takes place through cooperatives. So what we're talking about when Cliff refers to a new experiment is the introduction of non-agricultural cooperatives. And I've got some data in my book, which I have here somewhere. You have there, but it shows that before the licenses were frozen, it was something like 400 cooperatives, non-agricultural cooperatives, were created. And I think that there was a slight issue in the nature of them, because I mean, there was some discussion. There was an important article in Cuba Debate reflecting on them. Not much was said officially, I have to say. That's why we have to look at sort of, articles that have appeared that aren't formal statements. But there was some concern about whether these cooperatives, which were created from state enterprises or state outlets that were just basically told.
1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay. Okay.
So I'll just finish this point. There were like, say, a cafeteria that was state run, and it cost the state a lot of money to run. And the employees were given the opportunity to set up a cooperative. And I think it was pretty much presented as in, you either set up a cooperative or we close you down, because not many customers, it's costing the state money, they're having to cut back. And that it seems that there was quite an issue with the number of cooperatives that were set up in that way. And there was a discussion about them not being in the true spirit of the way that cooperatives are supposed to be set up, like collectives of workers who decide to collaborate together. So I don't know the extent to which it was that. I know that, as you will affirm, Cliff, because you've written about cooperatives and visited cooperatives, there not much has been said. So it's quite hard to judge. And I know that there is a certain sector of social scientists within Cuba who argue that the cooperative movement should be given much more space and leverage, because if you are going to have a non-state sector, recognizing that cooperatives aren't a socialist form of production, but if you're going to have a non-state sector, it's far better to have a collective, to promote a collective form of labor relations than privatized form, individual privatized form. So I think there's been some disappointment that they haven't been more promoted, and I could waffle on, but the short answer is I don't know.
Cliff, now I think you can hear me.
Yes, go
So
ahead, Al.
let me be real brief, because Helen's already really indicated most of the issues fundamentally the way I would. I do want to say that there is enthusiasm for cooperatives there, though not among everybody. But there's a hell of a lot of people that would like to form cooperatives in Cuba. And I'll just say that Beatriz Diaz, of course, who spoke at our conference a number of times. She and I have a contract to put out a book on cooperatives in Cuba, which has now been delayed for 1 year because of the COVID, and it'll be a year and a half. So it won't come out for probably another year and a half. But we have 12 Cuban authors who have contracted to write on this. And as Beatrice herself could explain, there is a lot of enthusiasm for co-ops in Cuba. There are other people who are less enthusiastic. There are differences of opinion on this in Cuba, as there are on every other thing in Cuba. But yes, there's a lot of enthusiasm, and it will go forward. The only question is to what degree and how soon.
By the way, for those who might not know, Al Campbell has put together a very interesting collection of articles under the title Cuban Economists on the Cuban Economy.
It's a great book. I use it for my courses.
Okay, I think David Schweikert was the next whose hand I had seen, so unmute yourself.
Mute here. Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for your talk, Helen. I haven't your book yet, but I bought it, and I'm going to read it. It's at the top of my list. I have two questions, basically. One is sort of historical. I first went to almost every year in the 90s, thanks to Cliff and that amazing conference that he had set up. This year, I was expecting to see people totally demoralized. And I could see people there, how demoralized they were. Communism didn't work. They couldn't wait to. And it was Cuba. I couldn't believe the kind of enthusiasm and dedication and so people showed. The young people in particular. It was amazing. And I'm just wondering what the attitude is in Cuba among the masses of people. Are they now demoralized? It doesn't work. We've got to do also work. So that's my first related. You mentioned the 2019 Constitution. I'm wondering what differences there might be. Is it significantly different from the original Constitution, or what have the changes showed? So morale now and differences in the Constitution.
Okay, that was cutting out quite a bit, but I believe that there were two questions. One is like, what is the kind of spirit, I guess, of the Cuban people now? And the other question was about the Constitution. And someone else asked about Constitution. There's two questions, I think, in the chat. One was from Oriana. How would you describe the changes in the new Constitution? And the other was to discuss the Constitution's emphasis on decentralization to the municipal level. So I'll start with the state of the Cuban population. I was in Cuba in December and January. I left in quite early January, just as the surge was starting, and Cubans were very fearful. They were very concerned about the increasing numbers. But since I left, they went up and up and up. So the situation with COVID has worsened massively. You may know that in the whole of 2020, Cuba had only 146 fatalities, deaths as a result of COVID-19, but they had more than that in January. So there's been a massive surge, and they've kind of lost the control that they had on community transmission, which is a result clearly of opening up in late November. But, you know, they felt obliged to do that, and for partly because of, again, the Bush measures and their struggling economy. I mean, so my experience in Cuba, I think things are really hard, and yet I didn't see, I saw that same thing you're talking about from the 1990s, just this incredible resilience and endurance, you know, just this sort of like, well, this is the way things are and we just have to get on with it. And, you know, I was there for New Year's Eve and the anniversary of the revolution, and then everyone, you know, just gets on with being with family and having a good party. So they certainly haven't lost that spirit of having a good party when I was there. But I think things are really tough. I mean, you know, and they find collective solutions. So I know people who working now in the COVID situation, but they get groups, they work in groups so that they only have to get up and get into a queue every few days, because the next day their neighbor does, or their work colleague. And then when they get to the front of the queue, they call each other and they all rush down to get the, you know, the products that are available. It is really tough though, I would say, the situation, but you know, they're just incredible resilience and endurance. I think there are some features that make it different, that make it more tricky, and that is the introduction of social media and a very clear social media campaign driven from the United States, driven from the Miami Cubans, to try and use, on the one hand, the US government squeezes the economy and creates, as was the initial expression expressed in the Lester Mallory's memorandum. Gosh, can't get that one out. Lester Mallory's memorandum in 1960. He said, you know, the Cuban government, the Cuban Revolution has too much support. There's no internal opposition. The only way we can carry out regime change is to use economic measures to create suffering and desperation to lead to the overthrow of government. And that is still the policy. So, you know, these sanctions under Trump are basically just doing the same thing that was attempted 60 years ago. But now you have the social media penetration. Cubans have the internet on their phone, and incredible amounts of money being put into, you know, YouTube shows and so on. And yet, you know, when it came to, they decided that some Cubans could mobilize during the caravana to go out onto the street to demand an end to the blockade. And from what I saw, it was kind of like a return to that jubilant defiance, you know, we will not be succumbed by US imperialism. So that's positive, but I will say it is very, very tough. Yeah, and with the extra fear of the COVID-19 pandemic. What was the other question was about the Constitution. Yeah, so there's quite a bit about the Constitution in my book, so I won't say too much about it. I think that someone asked a question about the decentralization. I think this is really interesting because there's quite a long-term drive to decentralize in Cuba. It's decentralized political power, political decision-making, and budgets to go with an effort to decentralize development. Why? Partly because communities know their own needs better than a central authority, but they have been frustrated for many decades because they make demands through the system of people's power, but there's no money to carry them out. So now there's an effort to decentralize the budgets so that local communities can carry out the changes, make local investments. It invests people more in what's going on around them. But I would say it's also linked, and this is something I'm starting to look at and work on, to the Tarea Vida life plan of how to have local sustainable development that helps to combat and mitigate climate change. So, you know, climate change solutions in Cuba are going to have to be very locally specific, and it's a one big process, decentralizing decision-making, budgets and solutions to the very real existential threats presented by climate change?
I might add to that. It was a good many years ago, probably 10 years ago at least, that we became aware of a new institute in Cuba, the Institute for Local Development. They were starting to talk about it that long ago, but it now has a new priority with the effort to decentralize and municipalize.
Yeah, I mean, when they created Maya Becky and, oh my God, my brain's just gone. What's it called?
The two new provinces.
The two new provinces, Altamisa. Oh God, my brain. That they did say, right, we're going to set up that we're going to create these new provinces, but with new experimental apparatus for decentralized decision making. And actually, it's entirely consistent with the political developments in Cuba and institutional political developments in Cuba, because they've never stopped critiquing, improving, developing, and changing their political institutions. So I just see this as the latest development, and you know, if it achieves what it sets out to do, is engage local communities and actually give them the capacity to affect change in their areas, then it's a really important step forward.
There was a William on the screen who had raised his hand earlier. I don't know William who, but if you'll turn your video on and unmute your mic.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks for the talk. Just a little bit about me. I grew up in South Florida during the 80s, and so this kind of thing has always been in the background while I was growing up. And but you know, I've learned a lot more about it as an adult and understand a little more. But what I would like to know is, I wasn't even aware that that Raul Castro recently stepped down. So I just learned that during your talk, and I wanted to know what you see as, you know, with the new president, what do you see going forward? Similarities or differences from the Castro administration, and also what are some, well, you've kind of touched on it somewhat too, what are some of the challenges that you see going forward for Cuba in the next decade or so? And one last remark, I believe the question that you asked at the end of your talk, I thought was very relevant and reminded me of a similar question that was asked by, can't remember the author, but the American sociologist who wrote Listen Yankee. Also, I believe, wondered what Cuba could become if it was not under the yoke of US imperialism. Thanks.
Okay. Shall I answer that now, Cliff, or?
Well, yes, but let me just add a footnote while talking about the changes that we might see coming down the road. You might talk about what, if any, changes have come out of the 8th Party Congress, which was just concluded a week ago.
Okay. So just to say for William, Raul Castro stood down as the Council of State, the President of the Council of State in 2018, and Miguel Diaz-Canel took over. And subsequently in the Constitution, his role changed. Now, this might seem like semantics, but it isn't exactly. He became the President of the Republic of Cuba. So we've always referred to, you know, Fidel Castro, Raul Castro as president, but they were actually the president of a Council of State, which had a collective approach to decision making at the highest legislative level of government. Miguel Diaz-Canel then, just a few weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, became the General Secretary of the Cuban Communist Party, because that's what happened at the 8th Congress of the Cuban Communist Party. Raúl Castro stood down, as he had said he would do, from that position, and it was taken up by Miguel Diaz-Canel. And that would happen. I mean, the mainstream media, I was interviewed by a fair few mediums, you know, they always act surprised, like, is it surprising that he's stood down? He hasn't waited until he's, you know, he's deaf. But no, it wasn't. He had laid out this plan, right, that you'd have a president who would then take over and be in dual roles for a period, and then relinquish the presidency to someone else who would come on. So in terms of what's going to be different from the 8th Party Congress, if you look at Miguel Diaz-Canel's speech towards the end of it, after he took over as the General Secretary, he says this has been the Congress of continuity. And, you know, really, since Miguel Diaz-Canel took over, there has been innovations, and there have been many new challenges, including the sanctions, actions and measures under Trump. But the hashtag, let's say, of the government has been hashtag continuity. We are continuity. And that was reiterated in the Congress. And he made a very conscious and clear point that while Raúl Castro was standing down from his leadership position, all important decisions would be run by Raúl. He would be consulted on them, and his opinion mattered. So for, you know, the mainstream media, who was sort of like, will Miguel Diaz-Canel take the baton and run in a different direction? It's inconceivable, I think. You know, plus the Cuban political institutions are far more collective and run on the far more emphasis to consensus decision making. Fidel Castro, even as an individual, had less power to you know, get new ministers in and get rid of other ministers than the Prime Minister of Britain does. And he certainly brings in his mates. We know that. That's another topic. Okay, so how different will it be from the Castros? Certain emphasis have changed. Miguel Diaz-Canel has really emphasized the importance of being engaged in social media. You know, we can't expect the 89-year-old Raúl Castro to make that a priority, although he did in his speech to the Congress also emphasize that there was a battle taking place on social media and Cuba had to be involved. But Miguel Diaz-Canel has a reputation for being quite socially liberal, you know, in the 1990s, supporting gay clubs, and reputation for, you know, getting down among the people, being very personalistic, getting involved and so on. But I think here the challenge is not really, the question is not really if there's a difference in politics. The question is that Miguel Diaz-Canel, as someone born after the revolution, entirely a product of Cuban socialism, educated under Cuban socialism, and all of his political experiences, an internationalist who went to Nicaragua and so on. The question is the kind of moral authority that Raúl, and before him Fidel Castro, had as the veterans who carried out the revolution. And that's been something that everyone highlights. But my initial, very unscientific experience from being in Cuba is Miguel Diaz-Canel seems to have won a lot of respect. People think he's doing a good job, and he is where he needs to be. He is, you know, where there are problems, he's seen, he's getting involved. So he has been given, you know, being involved through the COVID thing. He's been directly involved with scientists and speaking to the public. He's been appearing on the daily, not daily, but he has been appearing on the daily roundtable discussion show to explain the economic reforms. When a tornado happened in Havana out of the blue, he was there. So he seems, you know, to be regarded by the Cubans as very much having picked up the legacy of the Castros and the veterans of the revolution. And I think politically he's very much in the same line. It's very hard to distinguish, you know, some different political trend within Miguel Díaz-Canel. He has maintained the commitment to socialism, to anti-imperialist internationalism, and so on. So I don't know if that answers your questions, both about Miguel Díaz-Canel and the Constitution. I mean, other things, the Constitution was necessary because, you know, these issues I raised about how the Raúl's reforms encouraged the development of the non-state sector and even small businesses, so you can have individuals who now employ others. That was technically a violation of the Cuban Constitution of 1976. So the Constitution had to be amended to fit that in. And interestingly, it was Raúl Castro who convened and led the commission, which worked for something like 4 years on developing the first draft of the Constitution. And they took the opportunity of the Constitution being done to recognize other social issues that were really important on the question of you know, of who's represented and so on. There was controversy about the question of same-sex marriage. The evangelical church mobilized and agitated very strongly to basically have an opposition to the Constitution on the basis that they oppose same-sex marriage. So that has been deferred to an extent to a new family code, which is going to be introduced probably in the next year or so. I mean, everything's been put on frozen because of COVID-19. But yeah, I mean, and also the other aspect that comes out in the new Constitution, which wasn't as present at all in the old one, but it was present, is the importance of sustainable development and the environmental questions. That really comes out in the new Constitution. And there was an interesting debate that the draft Constitution was going to get rid of the statement that Cuba is a socialist and a socialist country working towards communism. And actually, the decision to remove that was opposed. People wanted to keep the reference or aspiration to communism in the Constitution.
Okay. Art Heitzer had a question in the chat box, but since he's in the here in the Zoom room, Art, you want to present your question directly? Art Heitzer, for those who may not know, is with the National Lawyers Guild, has been an activist for a long time on Cuba issues, heads up the National Lawyers Guild Committee on Cuba, I believe.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so thanks for this wonderful presentation, Helen, and all the sponsors. So I just was wondering if you would like to make any comments on racial and gender equality issues, including with any reference to the leadership from the Cuban Communist Party Congress and the Political Bureau. I think the Bureau has got 14 people. I think there's 3 women and 3 noticeably dark-skinned Cubans, and some commentary implied that people maybe were disappointed with that. But I just would like to hear your take on that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. This is a difficult issue, I think, I mean, because there's 2 things. Like, one is what's going on in the population, the other is what's going on in the National Assembly, which is the government, and the other is the party. So the Politburo has, as I understand it, 6 members, half of whom are Black. But to understand whether that's represented, I mean, the extent, clearly it's not representative in terms of women. You've just given the statistics yourself. But the question of white and non-white Cubans is more tricky, because if you look at the census, it's claimed that only 10% of Cubans are Black, but this is self-described, and many people claim that that is a massive underestimation. So it becomes very tricky if you want to see whether it's representative. In the National Assembly, the ratio is far more favorable to women and non-white Cubans. I think Cuba is now the second best in the world in terms of women in their parliament, National Assembly, in their government institutions, second to Rwanda. So Cuba's doing amazingly in terms of that, and also in the professions. It's just astonishing. Something like 66% of professionals in Cuba are women, including 60% of STEM, so science, technology, engineering, and maths. Now, I can tell you that towers above the ratio in Britain, right? Where, apparently we've had equality, except we haven't, because we still, as an academic, I can tell you that women academics are paid something like 80% of what men are paid, right? So, this is a battle globally, that's what I will say. In terms of the question of racial equality or inequality, discrimination clearly still exists on the individual level. And there has been criticism that it hasn't been robustly recognized or tackled. I think that is being addressed by Diaz-Canel, who is now heading up a new commission to deal with racial discrimination and equality that was set up in 2019. So they are conscious and consciously working on the issue. And I know that tomorrow, Nancy Moron, who is a Black writer in Cuba, an award-winning poet, is going to be speaking about these issues. So I would encourage you probably to listen to her rather than me on these issues. So yeah, I mean, a revolution is a process. These are challenging processes because they work at the level of individual mindsets. Discrimination is very deeply rooted, but also societies are made up of human beings, and human beings are flawed. That doesn't answer the question about, the representation of women in the Politburo and so on. I think that at this point you're going to have a lag. There's going to be a lag because actually Raul Castro has been talking for at least 8 years about the need to promote women and non-white Cubans into the top ranks. But they also, to be at the very top level, you need to have had the years of experience to be tried and tested. And so there's going to be a lag in seeing that reflected in the top leadership.
So Helen, your understanding is the Politburo is half Black or half Afro-Cuban? That's not what it looked like from just looking at faces.
Not the Politburo, hold on a minute. I've just forgotten the Secretariat. No, the Politburo, yes.
The Politburo is 14, I think.
Yeah, so it's not the Politburo, it's the one where there's 6. Hold on. Okay. Al, do you know the answer to this? I have it on in my documents, but I don't want to start looking it up.
Okay.
No, I don't. They changed all the names with the new constitution, and for us old people, it's hard to learn the new names.
I think it's the Council of State is where it's the government, not the party.
Well, in the government, yeah, you have 3 out of 6 vice presidents, I think, are. Yeah, is that right? Yeah, here we go. I can see it here.
Women and 3 people of color.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Thank you.
Hey, are there other questions of folks here in the Zoom room? Please wave at me if you want to speak. Okay, Al is waving.
The only thing I'll say is I did see Harry's hand up before mine. I'd like to be in the queue after Harry, but I think Harry was in before me.
Oh, I'm done. I forgot to put my hand down.
Oh, one of those guys, huh? Messing up the system. So I guess what I wanted to do is I wanted to make 2 quick economic comments, but not make them too narrow or anything. More in the broad sense that Helen has, which actually address real issues instead of economic issues. But first of all, I want to say is sometimes, when you make a comment, people think it's a criticism of what people say. So I have to make it very, very clear. I saw Helen's manuscript before it was published, and I agreed with every single word in it, every single one, even the ands and the buts and the its, and every one was correct. So I just want to make that clear. So what I want to say is on the two things, one on trade. And, Helen just in passing referred to the problem that all third world countries have, the shifting of the terms of trade, in particular, agricultural goods and mineral goods go down compared to manufactured goods. And I have a poster on my wall from Cuba from the 1970s making that point. But the point is that nowadays, and that's still true, and that's still a problem. But nowadays, there's additionally, people think about trade in a different way. And that really points out the problem that Cuba has now. And also why the blockade is such a big problem, which is that people think about value chains nowadays. When you produce a good, it's got 5 steps, it's got 20 steps, et cetera, et cetera. And unless you're big enough to be a continental economy like China or Russia or India or United States, if you're going to produce at an efficient scale, now some goods can be produced locally efficiently, but there's other goods which need to be produced at a scale larger than the 11 million people of Cuba in order to produce efficiently. And if you can't do that, you can't have a standard of living that corresponds to efficient production and have a good standard of living. And Cuba was integrated into a trade system bigger than itself, an international trade system, the Soviet-led Comecon system. And they were able to specialize in certain steps, and they bought the inputs and they sold the outputs, according to a quantitative plan then, but it doesn't matter. And when they had to reinsert themselves after that broke down in 1990, they had to reinsert themselves into the world system. And to give you an idea of what this is like, pick a country like Belgium or Netherlands that we think of as wealthy countries in Europe. They usually talk about the openness index, which they add the exports and imports together, which is kind of stupid, but just sort of divide that in half. The average of the exports and imports for Belgium is 82% of GDP, okay? And for Netherlands is 77%. And so it doesn't quite mean that they export and import 82% of their goods, but because that counts all the intermediate goods. But it shows you that if you're going to have a standard of living, if you're a small country like Netherlands, you've got to export and import vast amount. You've got to focus on certain steps, do those efficiently, buy the imports and sell the outputs. And Cuba is actually developing all sorts of new products, as Helen's book points out, what a heck of a lot of them are, the biotech goods. They also, in the 2018 figures, did tremendously in telecommunications on a world scale. That was one of their big earners. But if they can't buy the inputs and sell the outputs, they can't do that. And the blockade is screwing them up from doing that. So I just wanted to point out that this is why Cuba developing trade is not something like, well, that'd be a nice thing to do to improve. They cannot run the domestic economy efficiently unless they can trade, and they can't trade if the blockade is on. So it's huge. That's huge. The other thing I just wanted to say was on the plan and markets, and everybody has different ideas on this, but Helen was right at the very beginning. There's an increased discussion in the world, even the Economist magazine, about the return to planning, industrial planning in the capitalist world, and so people are talking about free markets versus state role, as she said. But first of all, we should understand the free market is a ridiculous term. Markets only exist, other than, where people are trading, whatever it is, coconuts for bananas. But if all real trade on a large scale is determined by the government. All the rules for trade, all the enforcement rules, contract rules are all determined by the government. And those determine who gets what out of the trade thing. So the idea of free markets is ridiculous. No markets are free. They're all constructed politically. And so this ties into the issue that a lot of people are worried about the expansion of market mechanisms in Cuba. And I just want to say that from my point of view, the expansion of market mechanisms is not a problem at all in and of itself. People can decide whether it's good or not, but the issue is, will those markets be socially controlled or not? That's the only, and there's no reason that a market cannot be socially controlled. And it does not have to be, and maybe it could be nowadays, could be quantitatively done, what they tried to do in the Soviet Union in the 1930s and they couldn't do. Maybe that could be done today, but that's not the way Cuba's going. And there's no reason that they can't introduce markets and socially control them, because that's what capitalist countries are doing, is socially controlling the markets and so forth and so on. So I just want to say the real issue isn't even plan versus market, because you can have a plan that controls things through the markets. The fundamental thing is, will you have socially determined production and distribution in society, or will you have production determined by individual capitalists that, because they own a piece of capital, decide what to produce, and then the society. So it's a question of social control versus control by capital. And it really gets confused, because everybody, including the left, calls capitalism the market society. And that's wrong. You've had markets in every society, and not just on the edges. I'll stop here, but people think that, oh, when you go back to feudalism, you go back to slave societies, yeah, they had markets, but those were luxury goods on the edge, and those were really running in capitalism. The fundamental center of the feudal society, the fundamental center of the slave society, as long as you have a division of labor, those people produced agricultural goods. They couldn't get their tools unless there was a market for exchange. And so markets have existed in every single society. So the issue is, do you have social control of your markets, or do you have the people that own capital decide what to produce so that they can, extract value from the labor of other people, as Helen said. That's all I was going to say.
Aren't we happy that Al was able to get his sound to work?
Maybe not. Maybe not.
Now, Harry, your hand is still up. Do you want to be recognized now?
Yes, I have a sort of general question for Helen and Al. Where does tourism fit? Is it possible for Cuba in a post-pandemic world to reestablish tourism? Was tourism a significant stimulus for the Cuban economy? Is tourism a kind of sort of weird inverted trade? Help me out.
We'll let Helen go first on that.
Okay, so yes, and yes. Tourism has been extremely important for Cuba, and it was a big deal when they took the decision in around the mid 1990s, in the context of the special period, to significantly open up tourism. Why? Because it was associated with the 1950s era under Batista. Well, in fact, sorry, or up to the revolution of Cuba being used as a sort of offshore brothel and casino for United States business people and so on. So it had a bad historical association, but they took the decision because they were forced to, essentially, to open up tourism, and they've been quite intelligent about it in the way that they've taken it forward, promoting family tourism and ecological tourism and these sorts of things. So tourism, when I said, there's so much I had to sort of rush through in the presentation. When I said that the battle of ideas was possible because the economy had started to recover, that was largely due to tourism. And you had big investments from Italy, from Spain, from the Netherlands, from Canada, and so on. So tourism was the main source of income for the Cuban economy until the export of medical professionals overtook it. And that was from late 2014, when Cuba sent the 20,000 medical professionals to Venezuela, and Chavez said, we'll pay you, first of all, in oil, and then we'll pay you in hard currency. So the main source of revenue for Cuba is still the export of medical professionals, but the second most important, the last time I've looked anyway, is still tourism. So tourism is very important, and Cuba, the Cuban economy had a terrible collapse last year as a result of, yes, the blockade and the pandemic. During 2020, the GDP fell by 11% and tourism fell by 75%. So that was a large part of the devastation that the Cuban economy experienced. Now you might have more empathy for understanding why Cuba opened up its international airports in late November, when it had the COVID-19 pandemic so well under control. But it took that decision, and you know, the price has been paid. I think it was necessary, but the price has been paid in terms of the surge of COVID-19. So yes, tourism is really important. It's considered a services export, and the other thing about tourism is it can, I mean, they picked tourism to kickstart the economy, restructured economy, for reintegration into the global economy. It takes minimal initial investment. It's good for employment because it's quite labor intensive. You know, you're employing lots of people to run in the hotels and so on. And, you know, you have a population that's very educated, speak lots of languages and so on. And Cuba is pristine, you know, compared to many other sort of coastal beach or Caribbean countries. It's pristine. It's really preserved its ecosystems, its coral reefs and so on. And they have actually made that a key part of their policy. So now under Tarea Vida, Life Task, the climate change policy, development policy that I talked about, is they are not allowed to build any more new hotels in coastal regions. They have to be built well inland, a mile inland or so on. So I think tourism, once the pandemic is under control, is definitely going to continue to be a mainstay of the Cuban economy. And you know, there's a lot of speculation about whether people will travel to Cuba to get the COVID-19 vaccine. I mean, I've been asked about that a lot in the press. I think that there are many logistical problems with that, but the fact is that there are people who will, around the world, who will be waiting and waiting and waiting, and Cuba will be a favorable option for them, not least because Cuban biotech products are going to be highly trusted. They're not the product of a profit-driven system. They are, you know, built on, basically developed to meet their public health needs. So we'll see about that. I hope that answers your question.
So Harry, let me add a little bit. She's made the political points as usual. Let me throw a couple of economic numbers at you to bore you after she's, you know, made the interesting comments. But it really connects to what I was saying before. In order to run the economy, in order to produce, they have to import, and they have to import goods, and they're not importing for consumption. Only 20% of their imports are consumption goods. 80% are non-consumption goods. Combination of capital goods, maybe 15%, and the rest is intermediate goods. Exactly what I was talking about. They have to massively import goods in order to run the economy. And they run a tremendous deficit on their imports are so much higher than their export of goods. And the way they pay for that is, as Helen said, with services. And that's the only way they can do it, services. And it's the only way they got out of the mess in 1990, restarted the economy. And in the 1990s, tourism was the engine of the economy. It was the thing that turned it around, as she said, because of its quick payback things. Companies in Spain and place were interested in investing. And so it earned the services which paid for the goods, which allowed them to reactivate the economy starting in 94. And as Helen said, by the year 2000, it was only one of three top things. There was nickel, also good, and there was medical services, which came online. And nickel since then has dropped an awful lot, and nickel prices have gone down. And so in the year, so in 2018, they had 14.5 exports of goods and services together, $14.5 billion or pesos, and we won't talk about that. You have to, tourism at that point was only $3 billion. So that gives you an idea. Is tourism important? Yeah, it's very important, as Helen said. And when it drops, that's a big problem. But it's not the engine of the economy anymore. It's one of the leading sectors that they have to do. In 2018, that was the first year that they've published the earnings from the medical exports. They haven't before that because the United States then goes around all the countries and puts pressure on them to throw the doctors out or recruit the doctors, et cetera, et cetera. So they had 6.5 billion in medical exports in 2018, twice the tourism earnings. So that again puts tourism in perspective. Tremendously important, but not so important. And right now, as she said, the tourism in this last year is tanked in Cuba as it has everywhere else in the world. They should be able to make that up by selling even more of their medical exports, but there's the blockade once again, with the United States sending people to every country, including Andorra, to try to disrupt the contracting for medical services for there. So the answer is they no longer depend upon tourism as the engine of the economy. It is going to continue to be important. There's no reason that it shouldn't come back, just as Helen said. But the fundamental question is, will some of the other things be able to come back? And all those things, tourism actually less than the others concerning the blockade. Well, there's the American market on the tourism too. But the fundamental question for the recovery of the tourism economy actually is if they could even get the blockade back to the severe level that it was under Obama, that would be a huge shot in the arm of the Cuban economy. But it's now looking pretty clear that Biden is absolutely not going to do that.
Elena Benedito has had her hand up so long that her arm is probably numb by now. So let's give her a chance to speak.
I've been exercising my patience, which is not usual. But thank you. I'll feel free to answer as long or as short as you want. You mentioned, you touched on sustainability, and I was wondering about how sustainability has been applied in the agricultural area, but specifically in cities. So are there any urban gardens? Are neighborhoods organized to produce their own beans or whatever it is, or mango trees or whatever? I know that they have the local markets, the agros, but I don't know whether there is any initiative in the shape of cooperatives at that level. And just a little comment about cooperatives. When I began to go to Cuba in 2015, one of my first visits was to the Instituto de Filosofía and to the workshops that they were doing for two emerging cooperatives. One was a sewing cooperative and one was a transportation cooperative. And what really surprised me is that they had contacted the Instituto de Filosofía so that they could learn together on how to apply the principles of socialism to the building of their cooperatives, so that they could have a pathway to do things that wouldn't just repeat old schemas or bring in new words or whatever. So I think that there was a lot of support for those things, but also raised awareness of what a cooperative meant. So
okay, thanks for those two really interesting questions. I just want to go back to the cooperatives issue, because there is an issue which I didn't raise before, but it was in the back of my mind, and that is I recall when I went to Venezuela briefly to work with the Vice Ministry of the Communal Economy, and I was having a discussion with the people who had been put in charge of managing these newly created cooperatives in Venezuela, and they were having a terrible time. And the reason is because Chavez had made a comment, he had made a statement that people who set up as cooperatives by a certain date would have some kind of tax reduction, right? So literally thousands of private companies had just re-registered themselves as cooperatives, but nothing else had changed. Yeah. So I think when I was talking about, issues in Cuba about whether these the extent to which these cooperatives were set up in the true spirit of cooperatives of mutual association among workers and so on, I think that was that's probably a reference point, yeah, to avoid the mistakes that were made in Venezuela when they just, let capitalists enterprises pretend they were cooperatives just to get tax relief. So that's on that question. And yeah, that kind of thing happens. And it's great. And, I've spoken to women economists who set up, do work with women, how they can enter the employment and how they can, manage their own economy, set up productively and all the rest of it. That all the workshops are happening all the time and going on like that. It's very indicative though, at least the statistic when I was looking into it for my book, only 8% of people who are set up as a private business owner in Cuba under the new regulations are women. Compare that with the 66% of professionals being women. And what you can see is that actually, the capitalist structure, the capitalist social relations are inherently discriminate against women far more than having state employment or collective employment. And actually the role of women in cooperatives is lower as well. So that's really interesting. In terms of sustainability, I would encourage you to watch a documentary that is really out of date, but still wonderful, called The Power of Community, How Cuba Survived Peak Oil. Or is it the other way around? I never remember. Anyway, it shows how, when we talk about Cuba losing 86 or 87% of its imports, we are including fuel and fertilizers and pesticides and all the equipment and tools needed for highly industrialized agriculture. It is shocking how highly industrialized Cuban agriculture was in the 1980s before the collapse of the Soviet bloc. They had 90,000 tractors, and those tractors require fuel, petroleum, whatever you want to call it. So what happens when the imports from the Soviet Union fall from 13 million tons of oil in 1989 to 1 million in 1991 and then 0 in 1992, you have to leave those tractors parked up in the garage. There's no alternative. But interestingly, and this is what I found with biotechnology, with the energy revolution, there was a team in Cuba who was working on organic techniques, who was, working with some of the old campesinos, the old farmers who remembered crop rotation and organic pesticides and all the rest of it. And so basically they just got organized and they trained up people. They went to every cooperative, because this is happening at the same time as they're massively expanding the number of agricultural cooperatives. So they had 70% of agriculture was state farms, and there was a massive transferal of state farm land into cooperatives, and to a lesser degree to small family farms and so on. And you know, these old veterans, these old campesinos went round from cooperative to cooperative, training them in these techniques. And Cuba is now a world leader and exporter of biopesticides and biofertilizers. And you know, they use the worms, I've forgotten the name, the specific name, and they use animal traction. So you know, they went back to using animals to plow the land and so on. And organic farming. So it became some of these were measures that were out of necessity. They had no option but to stop using fertilizers. But actually, they have strong advocates in Cuba. And as a consequence, they are now embedded in law. So in law, you cannot use chemical fertilizers except in some state farms for tobacco and sugar. But you know, the cooperatives can't use pesticides, they can't use chemical pesticides and so on. And the other element that developed was something called organiponicos. Have you heard of these? These are like the urban organic farms or plots of land. They can be very small, it can be a small plot of land that was set up in the context of the special period. Interestingly, they were first developed within the revolutionary armed forces under Raúl Castro. And they were then expanded in the context of severe food shortage. I mean, if you look at the statistics, it's shocking. Food imports fell by 60%. And yet, food consumption didn't fall by the same. Why? Because it was compensated by domestic production. So Cubans started to produce in their own gardens, on their own patios, and swap with neighbors. And you know, as buildings collapsed and the land was just sort of wasteland, it was taken over by communities. Just wonderful projects took place. And within something like 10 years, 300,000 paid jobs were created to work on these organiponicos, which are specifically in cities. So it's a wonderful thing. You've seen the local food distribution. The idea is that they are selling food that is produced locally. So you massively decrease the cost and the demand for fuel of transportation when you're not moving things around the country where you don't have one center. And there's still a lot of work to do. Raúl Castro's first speech when he took over as president of the Council of State in 2017 included a very harsh criticism of this crazy system of pasteurizing milk. So it was taken from local farms to one centralized place and then transported around the country. And, you know, and he was pointing out what an incredible consumption of fuel and therefore money, of the country's money that was taking. So they have done wonderful things. And as I said, they came out first in Jason Hickel's Sustainability Development Index last year. But even back in 2006, the World Wildlife Fund did an analysis of sustainable development, and Cuba at that point was the only country in the world to have achieved sustainable development, which they define as living within the carrying capacity of their ecosystem whilst improving the standard of living. So, you know, I've written about this recently, it hasn't been published yet, another book chapter. But again, when you look at sustainable development, you find that there were people championing this and there were institutions set up all the way from the beginning of the revolution, all the way through. So it's quite an incredible story.
If I could go back to Elena's point about the sewing cooperative that the Institute of Philosophy was doing workshops in for the workers to learn about the principles of cooperativism. I visited that as well, and it is one of the state conversions. You know, cooperatives that were self-formed among workers who came together to form a cooperative generally were on a much better path for success. But most of the cooperatives that were established were actually converted state enterprises that the state wanted to get rid of and turned them over to the to the workers and said, well, now you can be a cooperative. And this sewing cooperative was one of those. And what that meant is that the workforce was used to the kind of top-down authoritative relations that had prevailed, and were not disposed to the kind of self-initiative that is needed for a successful cooperative. I visited that cooperative. I think it was in its first year as a new cooperative. And one of the things that struck me was the attitude of the president of the cooperative, who had previously been the director under as a state enterprise. And the way she spoke about my workers as if, you know, she was the one in charge of them, rather than, as is supposed to be the case with cooperatives, she was subject to the decisions of the General Assembly of Workers. Clearly, you know, the main change that had occurred with her, for her, was that no longer did she have to clear her decisions with higher ups. She had more autonomy. So clearly there was need for re-education. And Helen quotes that observation in her book. Thank you for that credit, Helen. But as a follow-up, let me tell you, I went back the next year and visited again. There was a new director, and things seemed to be much more congenial. And I was able to ask some of the workers, as an aside, out of the observation or earshot of the director, you know, how they thought of the new director in comparison to the previous one. And they all said, much, much better. Yeah, he's with us. So, you know, what you have is a process of workers learning a cooperative way. And the Institute of Philosophy was playing a role in helping to teach workers that new set of values. And there are other institutions besides the Institute of Philosophy, I understand, that have been doing the same. Well,
So I remember, I must have been in between those 2 points, because I remember a comment saying, one of the women were saying, because if we are going to keep doing things the same way, why did we become a cooperative? And I mean, that level of awareness, I thought it was fantastic that they would think about those things. They were not just worker robots. They were thinking about the philosophical implications of all those things.
Yes, but old habits run deep.
Yep.
Another report back from that sewing enterprise was that the Institute of Philosophy gave them a propane burner to make coffee. They had a lunchroom, but they had not been able to make coffee. And so they gave them that propane burner. And when the Institute researchers came back later, they saw it still wasn't being used. And they said, well, we don't have any fuel for it. They hadn't realized that they had to order the fuel. That, in other words, they hadn't really learned to take initiatives and take responsibilities. So it is a learning process. Well, are there any final questions or comments? We need to end soon. We've gone over time, but Jill Hamburg just had her hand up. So if it's a brief question.
Okay, well, I don't know how brief this will be. It takes off from the co-ops, but leads to another thing. My understanding was that of the co-ops that got set up before they stopped giving licenses, there were about 400 that had previously been restaurants and so on run by the state, and and whoever was director became the president automatically and so on. But that there were another 100. And of those other 100, 20 were that were genuinely set up independently of having been state before. 20 were really small firms with entrepreneurs, but it was the only way they could incorporate, because there is no way that the self-employed can incorporate so far. So my question is, what is your perspective on what the economists, call pymes, the small and, in Spanish, the small and medium sized companies, and there keeps being talk about a law that will legalize, that make it possible to incorporate. So what perspectives do you see on small and medium size enterprises? That's the first. And the second is professionals in the self-employed sector. There's a huge thing going on among architects now, because they are not on the list of people who can be legally employed privately, which is tricky because a lot are working privately on the side. And whereas veterinarians are allowed to now do it with pets, but not other things. So do you have any perspective on some of those issues?
Yeah, thanks for that. So I'm going to answer probably not with a very useful way for a conversation that's just about to end, but it's sort of linking back to something Al was saying, because I don't entirely agree with Al on the question of markets and social control, because I think that once you start to open up to market mechanisms, to the ability for private accumulation, it develops its own logic, right? And the question is the extent to which these new economic forces are able to gain some political influence. And I think that process is already clear. Why is it clear? Because when they said they were going to start introducing the licenses again for small and medium enterprises, self-employment, and the cooperatives, they said that they would restrict the number of businesses people could have, restrict the number of people who could sit in a private restaurant at Paladar, and there was uproar. And that is political pressure. They subsequently withdraw those restrictions. So I think that actually it is very hard to open the door and keep the lid on at the same time. And we see that now with the fact that they have just extended 10 times the number of, something like 10 times the number of areas in which you can be self-employed or set up a small business. And they include pets, but not architects. So there is a clamour. So what you see is that people are putting political pressure on the system. And this is, as Che saw it, this was a big issue, and it's inevitable. The superstructure starts to impose pressure for change in the infrastructure, the social relations. Why might there be a difference between architects and vets? I don't know. Maybe because vets are dealing with animals, not infrastructure, not building, not I don't know what that there's obviously some logic behind it, or maybe not, maybe there isn't. But what we see is the more you open up to market mechanisms, the more pressure that grows to keep the momentum. And I think it's very difficult. It takes a lot of political education and consciousness to keep that limit on, because at the moment, Cubans who are engaged in private business or self-employment, right, they believe, a lot of them, and I don't want to speak for people, but the message that you get is a belief that they can have the best of both worlds. So nobody in Cuba wants to lose the healthcare system or the education system, which is free and high quality, and they can access at any point and is abundant. But at the same time, they want some of those capitalist freedoms to set up a business, to make money, to employ others, exploitation, formerly in Marxist terms. Yeah. So this is the problem. But, you know, the balance shifts. If you go too far, this is why I call it a tightrope. If you balance too far to one end, you will fall over. And the question is, how do, you know, are the Cubans in control? As Al says, to this extent, it is a question of control. Are they in control of how far they lean over to one side without losing their balance and falling on the side of the market? And I think it's incredibly challenging. And at the time I was finishing my manuscript, my final chapter was on that challenge. However, in political economy terms, that challenge got superseded by the sheer challenge of survival, which is where we're at now with Cuba. And those questions, and you know, why they haven't created more cooperatives and the benefits of cooperatives versus private businesses in terms of their objective, which is productivity, which is meeting the need for goods that the Cuban state can't provide, and so on and so forth, and which is better for stimulating those imports that, as Al said, are an important, essential part of domestic production. Those questions are, in a sense, on the sideline to the question of how Cuba can survive this incredible, intense economic pressure, the scarcity, the COVID-19 pandemic, because let's not forget that Trump may have gone, but none of the measures that he introduced, the 242 measures that he introduced to make Cubans suffer and have hardship and scarcity, as the original conception was, none of them have been reversed. And as long as Biden and his administration declares that this is not our priority, we haven't got round to making an announcement, Cubans continue to suffer on a daily basis from those measures. So I think those questions that you raise are pendant. I think they're huge challenges, but nothing that Cuba does should be understood as if it is just a political preference, right? When Raul Castro said we must open up to small and medium businesses, it's not because it was a political preference, it's economic expediency. And the question is, how far can they go within the framework of the socialist planned economy and with investments on social welfare? And let's not forget, this is a country that was underdeveloped for 400 years by colonialism and imperialism. And quite frankly, it is astonishing, as I said, and I will reiterate, that they can have human development indicators that rival the advanced capitalist countries that benefited from hundreds of years of imperialism, colonialism and imperialism.
I know we're late, Cliff, but I did want to say something directly to what Jill asked. The difference between Helen and me is actually very small. The question is whether market mechanisms, I'm totally against accumulation. I'm not against market mechanisms. But so on co-ops, your point is right. So they set up an experiment, 498 experiments. About 2/3 of those were state conversion. 1/3 of them were the type that we're talking about that are more authentic. The type that were more authentic did vastly better. 20 or 30 it didn't happen at all, and then they cut it off. And then they stopped issuing any more licenses. And they talked since then about making a general co-op law, and they still haven't passed that yet, and it will come sometime. They're also now talking about a PIMS law, small and medium enterprise law. Those are separate laws, but the co-op law doesn't exist. So the only way you can form a co-op now is to apply as a series of 5 or 10 independent cuentapropistas and then operate yourself as a co-op. So people do that too. Okay, so that's the inadequate stuff. That's on that. But the issue of the PIMS and talking about what they mean, this is very, very important. And it's in some articles, in fact, including the one that's going to come out in June in the International Journal of Cuban Studies, where I actually cite some of these sources and everything. But in the '76 Constitution, it was illegal to hire anybody else. The term was you couldn't exploit anybody else, but that was understood as you couldn't hire anyone else. And when they set up the cuentapropistas in '73 and '74, there was no hiring of anyone else. And that's why I've written in a number of articles, capitalism cannot possibly exist off of Cuentapropistas because there's no exploitation. It's like the first 3 chapters of Capital. There's markets, there's exchange, but there's no capital and no exploitation. But of course, and this is exactly Helen's point, that naturally evolves into something else. So sometime, I'm not exactly sure when, I've tried to get the exact name, but by 2014, I have an article, which I think I cite in that other place. They had pushed the Cuentapropistas up again, the number of Cuentapropistas, so it was getting up to 400,000, 500,000. But it turned out that they'd introduced a new category into the Cuentapropistas. And that category by 2014 was called, I am self-employed as an employee of somebody else. Okay, so and that didn't exist. It was workers. It was absolutely workers, and those people were being exploited, and there was accumulation going. So from real market mechanisms per se, there's no accumulation. It doesn't have to be, but from employment, there will always be, and markets tend to go that way, as we saw there. But they could be blocked. They didn't have to open up that category. If they don't open the category, then the people do it illegally under the table, and that's a problem too. So this is, to my mind, the biggest danger for the Cuban Revolution going forward. They have to think about it carefully. They are talking about it. I'm not saying it's going to fail or succeed. I'm just saying this is the biggest danger. They are going to make the hiring of labor legal. Okay, that is something they removed from the Constitution that came out this time. There's no longer a clause saying you can't exploit other people, and that's only meaning that's only meaning that they know very well that they're going to legalize hiring other people. Legalizing hiring other people is circuits of capital, and circuits of capital means accumulation, and that means capitalism within the system, and that can have a tendency to grow. So that stuff's very dangerous. I'm totally opposed to that as dangerous, that has to be controlled. And I make a distinction between that and market mechanisms. But the PIMS law has not yet been passed either. And we'll see how fast that comes. I'll stop with this. My final hope is that they enact the PIMS legislation about as fast as they enacted the unification of the money systems after they announced it, because that gives us a good 8 years.
Okay, well, we've had a very fruitful exchange here and gone well over time. And I want to thank those who have stayed with us for this stimulating discussion, but especially I want to thank Helen for a really comprehensive and insightful presentation and responding to our questions, and all of the rest of you that participated in this dialogue. I'm sure everyone else found it as informative as I did. I hope our audience did. I want to thank all of you who contributed to the discussion. Today's webinar, as well as past programs, are available on YouTube, accessible from our website, www.globaljusticecenter.org. Next week, we will be having another exciting webinar on a really provocative topic, namely the Zapatistas. We will have talks by 2 social scientists who've done a fascinating book studying the Zapatistas as an example of a community that lives on the edge of capitalism, as well as on the edge of the state. So join us next Monday for that. Finally, I want to thank our webinar team, Liz Mestras, Gregory Diamant, Roberto Robles, Olivia Canales, Bob Stone, and yours truly. But before we go, let me just sign off with Helen had mentioned her favorite Cuban song, and I think I've located it. Let me share it with you now.
You have to turn the volume up.
He took me back to East Atlanta. Fresh out East Atlanta with no mountains. Damn, fresh out East Atlanta. Up on board like a traffic jam. Man, I was quick to pay that girl like Uncle Sam. He go, hey, take it on me. Hey, shout the craving on me, get the beating on me, on me. She waited on me, then what? Shout the caking on me, got the bacon on me. No, this is history and I'm making on me, on me. Point blank, close range, that feed. If it goes $1 million, that's me. I was getting moolah, baby.
Havana, ooh, nah, nah. Hey. Half of my heart is in Havana, ooh, nah, nah. He took me back to East Atlanta, nah, nah, nah. All of my heart is in Havana. My heart is in Havana. Havana, take me back, back, back. 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 Havana, ooh, nah, nah. Half of my heart is in Havana, ooh, nah, nah. He took me back to East Atlanta, nah, nah, nah. All of my heart is in Havana. My heart is in Havana. Havana, ooh, nah, nah.
Well, I wasn't expecting that, Cliff. Thank you.
Well, I didn't know that was a favorite of yours, so.
I just like the chorus.
Well, thank you again, and I think we must sign off by now. We've gone over 2 hours.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Cliff, for organising, for the Centre for Global Justice, and for everyone who's attended.
And thank you for all the work that you have done.
Okay.